All right, good afternoon and welcome to the Values and Family in the Built Environment session. My name is Sam Palfreyman. I'm a Historic Sites Curator with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also a PhD candidate at Boston University in American Studies. I'll remind you of the routine here, and then we'll get started. We have 3 wonderful papers today, 3 speakers with us. Please hold all comments until after all 3 speakers have given, and also I'll give some response, and then we'll get into questions. So without further ado, our first speaker is Deanna Blake, who is a student at Utah Valley University majoring in history. She is in the last year of her bachelor's degree with hopes of attending Cambridge University for her master's degree in medieval and early modern history. Our second speaker is Ken Rockwell, a librarian at the University of Utah's J. Willard Marriott Library. His work includes providing descriptive metadata to the digital library, in which thousands of historical documents, photographs, and videos are made available online. He holds an MA in geography and a master's degree in library science and is a published genealogist. Our concluding speaker will be Chris Hansen, who is a preservation planner with the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. He has a bachelor's degree in history from Weber State University and a master's degree in urban planning from Eastern Washington University. The names of the papers, I should probably tell you too. Deanna's is titled The Hansen Family Dairy. Ken's is Religious Diversity in Salt Lake City, Historical and Contemporary Photographs at the University of Utah's Marriott Library. And Chris's paper is titled Cheap Homes, a 19th-century prefabricated house mail-order company in Ogden, Utah. And with that, we'll start with Deanna's paper.
The Mormon Church was known for its emphasis on community. From the first day they came to the Salt Lake Valley, they encouraged those who came to work together and create communities that were stronger so they could protect themselves from the Native Americans and create religious and economic harmony. Church leaders emphasized pulling resources to create these communities successfully, working to create Zion, the glorious fabled city believed to be prophesied to be in America, according to the Book of Mormon and church doctrine. The church president, Brigham Young, created the idea of cooperative businesses. The movement was formed out of fear and the wanting to break free from the Gentile rule. To unite together the feelings of the people by the cooperating their interests in the meaning to make themselves sustaining according to the spirit of our teachings and to make them independent of Gentile stores, is a quote from Brigham Young. When the railroad came in, people began to drift away from the church and been more favorable towards their businesses. The church emphasis on community and serving others began to waver. The best way Young could see was to create the mercantiles that formed in places like Brigham City and San Pete Valley. My family was one of the families that formed the mercantile in Brigham City, the Brigham City Co-op. That was formed by Brigham Young himself and a few other men. My family's dairy was 20 minutes outside of the community in a place called Cohen, and my great-great-grandfather formed the co-op in hopes that his dairy would grow faster. He was called to this by the church leaders in hopes that his family's status in the United States would improve as well. This place was called Cottonwood Hollow and Sleepy Hollow, and his wives were divided between the 2 properties. The dairy was ran by his great-granddaughter Larive and her husband Frank up until the 70s, but up until 1873 there was a lot of success, and then a tax formed by the government of $10,200 was put towards here in the United States for trade. in Utah specifically, and that created a lot of problems in the dairy. According to an interview with Utah's Pioneer Society, Daughters of the Utah Pioneer Society Secretary Carol Hansen, she said, Snow and several other local church leaders bought the first stocks of the mercantile, and several other members of the community came in later. The stocks were usually bought for about $5, but you could also give food and labor and other goods in exchange for them. Most of Box Elder County was involved. The enterprise grew quickly. Lorenzo Snow and Brigham Young were very proud of this. The dairy itself made quite a bit of money. There's a quote here that says, "This year we have 260 cows and are doing fine profitably. The business is making 8 cheeses per day of 400 leaves each. These keep a fine lot. We find a lot of hogs, which together there are mutton and sheep and other animals as well. In the summer, season supplies at the butcher shops fall. In the winter, we send the cows back. The building of the dairy fixtures and the corral for the pigs costs $4,000. They intended on adding some improvements next year to increase our dairy to 400 cows. The cooperation shared this season with Brother Christensen will remain on the premises throughout the year." Sorry, I'm all mixed up. The dairy's money became very influential in the community. Everybody was able to have cheese and butter and stuff, and in return they would send their cows up to the dairy. My grandfather wrote in his journal that he was hoping to one day publish, but was unable to do so. He said that his father was called by President Snow to Cottonwood Hollow to start the dairy, and the old dairy made much money. He talks in his journal about the church having money that they created here just in Utah. This money was very important to the people here, but unfortunately when the tax came and the mercantiles became illegal, there was some soldiers that came in and burnt all the money. The dairy before that sometimes had as many as 700 cows, and it had been successful due to the work that that Christian Hansen's wife Sarah did. She came here with him from Denmark, and in Denmark she had learned to make the cheese and stuff that they did at the dairy, and that's why they were called to this specific place this specific job when they came to Utah. It says here in an interview with one of my grandma's cousins, it says, "Grandpa opened the milk factory in Logan, and he produced under the Hickleberry brand, honeysuckle brand, which he later sold to the factory to a company called Borden Company. He retired at age 75 and left his dairy to James Christian Hansen. That's my grandma's great-grandpa. So. James Christian Hansen did not have multiple wives, but he was still successful at being able to do a lot of the stuff that he was supposed to with the dairy. The reason why my great-grandfather Christian Hansen was so good at it was because he had much help from his 3 wives and his many children. When the tax came in and the money was burnt, the money that was made by the church, The dairy, unfortunately, was not able to make as much money as it did before, and that is due to the government wanting to stop polygamy and to prevent the church from having its own sustainable environment. This created a lot of tension in the family and a lot of tension in the community. We had to drop out of the mercantile, out of the co-op, and the mercantile eventually was closed down. Unfortunately, I only had half of my notes, and I don't think I can continue without them.
Okay.
But basically, the argument there that I had was the government prevented self-sustainability in Utah. Thank you.
Right. Hello, I'm Ken Rockwell. I'm a metadata librarian at the University of Utah's Marriott Library. Let's see, got to figure out. There we go. Yes, and we've been digitizing thousands of records and our unique historical treasures as part of our digital library, and I provide information about them to make them more accessible. And among the things we have are thousands of historical photographs, including the collection of Newell Beeman. Newell Beeman was a retired businessman who in the 1910s made a hobby of photographing historical buildings around town, including historical churches. And that gave me an idea. We've been creating digital exhibits to tell stories that bring attention to some of our treasures. And I got the idea of creating a digital exhibit that would show the changing religious landscape of Salt Lake City through its architecture, through its historic buildings. This could include newer photos that show the churches as they are today that Newell Beeman photographed a century ago. And this sort of took over my life for a bit. It became a complete new collection in its own right, sort of a centennial update on Newell Beeman's work, and is now a separate collection up in our digital library, the Salt Lake City Religious Architecture photograph collection. And so it now includes photos that of churches that were not around a century ago and that we might not have any historical photos of, but that have come up since that time. Some resources I used to locate some of these historical churches were the Polk directories, the city directories, and also the Sanborn fire insurance maps. If you're not familiar with them, they're wonderful resources showing on a large page a single block of the city with all of its buildings and what they're made of, and often identifying built businesses or churches. So quite useful. And to another resource I used was Google Earth and its Street View to check out the locations of these places to see if are those historic structures still there. Here's a photo that Beeman snapped back. It started out as a Methodist church and had become home of the Josephites, as he called it, the RLDS church in the 1910s. And you can see the structure is still there, although it's currently vacant. Whereas here was an old Baptist church in the 9th district that's clearly been replaced by a modern home. One thing to keep in mind when dealing with older resources, including the Sanborns and the Polk directories, is how the addresses have changed. In 1973, they made a grand decision to change 2nd West to 3rd West. First North was 2nd North. So you have to keep that in mind when trying to track down these places. Now, I also brought in the histories of these different buildings when I could find them, and sometimes they're available on websites related to an individual church. Sometimes collections like LDS architecture for various historic ward houses, and many of these buildings are on the National Register of Historic Places, and their applications are online. Those provided a lot of good information, which I could then put into the metadata for the new photos I was putting up. I'd also provide links to the historical photos when they existed. I also provided latitude and longitude so as to generate a geospatial interface where you can locate the individual church buildings. I'm going to go into a little of the history and the fact, of course, you know, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had sort of a monopoly on religious buildings for the first 20 years or so, but with the increasing Gentile population and the growth of new religious communities, new buildings started coming up, and some of which, like St. Mark's, are still around, and others which are now gone, whether Protestant or Catholic or Jewish. As new ethnic communities came in, such as the Greeks and the Japanese, the religious diversity continued to develop, and the language needs of the immigrant communities were often met by individual churches. There were several Lutheran and Methodist churches, depending on the language of the groups, and the LDS wards sometimes reflected this too. A Russian ward even has Russian architecture style built into it. And as congregations grew, they often needed new facilities. They'd move out and establish new buildings. And here, a good example is Calvary Baptist Church, this African American congregation. By the time Newell Beeman was working, they were in their second building, and as of 2018, they're in their fourth. So they've done well, and 3 of the 4 buildings still exist. So one of the interesting things I was exploring was how buildings get repurposed. What happens when a church moves out? What happens to the building? It's acting up again. Let's see. Can the authority come forward? Yeah. So what happens when a building gets vacated? It sometimes becomes the home of new communities, as in the first Church of Christ Scientist, Christian Science Church downtown, now the home of a Spanish-speaking congregation. And then one of the old synagogues downtown is an Orthodox church now. And then there's the case of an old Pentecostal church on 700 West that was remodeled by Bosnian refugees into this handsome mosque. Now, I'm using a side about the picture on the left. That's not one of our historic photos. That was taken off of Google Earth Street View, and you can still see the old church before renovation. It's still up there today because I guess Google hasn't driven by since then. So, isn't it nice to know that even Google can be behind the times? Yeah. There are several cases of the of LDS ward houses being taken over by various Protestant churches. Did everyone know the Salvation Army is actually a church denomination? It's not just a service organization, but they have their own services. Besides becoming the homes of other religious communities, they sometimes are repurposed for secular uses, such as the old Baptist church downtown, now an antique store. And this Congregational Church on the 7th East is now an office interior store. And a similar business occupies the first synagogue downtown. And let's see. And some of the old LDS ward houses are occupied by cultural groups, such as the Center for Choral Music. And along the line, I've found some interesting buildings that are lesser known, such as a third old synagogue from a Yiddish-speaking congregation that's now an architect's office, but it was established in the 20s and 30s. So let's see. Also, here's another old church, Seventh-day Adventist. Of course, they meet on Saturdays, so on Sundays a group called the Full Gospel Assembly occupied it for several decades. But groups like that are hard to pin down. If they've been gone for decades, it's hard to find out historical information about them. The repurposing goes the other direction too. Buildings originally built for secular purposes have become homes of new communities, such as a Tongan congregation. And this old bank on North Temple has now been remodeled into a mosque. And no one would mistake this Buddhist temple for the private residence it once was. Now I'm going to go into oops. Yeah, and the landscape continues to change. New communities come into being, and they often get started in rented facilities, such as the Infinity Event Center. Actually, I think that's kind of a nice fit. Infinity, calling attention to things eternal, maybe, just like churches try to do. And when they're lucky, these new groups can move into their own facilities when they have the need. It just happened that a church was moving to other facilities, and Gospel Grace Church was able to pick it up just a few years ago. So the landscape is continuing to change. Now I'm going to talk about a few limits that I set on this project of photographing all the churches in Salt Lake. I decided not to try every ward house because there are so many of them, and so I concentrated on ones with some of the older ones with interesting architecture. And even so, as you saw with those two churches that were repurposed as Protestant churches, we've got samples from even the newer buildings. And I also didn't do every building that's primarily of secular use that was a temporary home for various congregations. That store on the left, which was recently a music store and now is a clothing boutique, it was briefly, back in the 70s, a home of a Krishna temple. But that was only in one Pope directory that I saw that. But anyway, let's see. Yeah, I also didn't do every single spot that had a church that is no longer there, where there's nothing left of the originals. There are quite a few of them. I wanted to keep this to a reasonable size. But I made one exception, and that was an old ward house in the Avenues that it followed a similar pattern. They'd build a new facility and tear down the old and replace it with a parking lot. But the thing that's different in this case is they didn't just tear down the old building. They carefully demolished it or dismantled it and reconstructed it on Capitol Hill. And it's now a special events center. One more restriction on my project was that I restrained myself to within the bounds of the city because there's plenty more county that I didn't want to have to keep this project going forever. And so that's why St. Anne's Catholic Church, which is on the south side of 21st South, got left out. And the big regret I have about this is that there's a number of traditions that are well represented in the city, like Islam and Buddhism, but the Hindus and the Sikhs have their main facilities in other cities, so I just took these pictures for the sake of this presentation. Anyway, so I'm this is just a screen in case you wanted to whip out your phones and get all of these links where you're going to find our religious exhibit, our digital exhibit that got this thing started, as well as the collection. And that's. I could also mention that I have a much longer version of this with a lot more history that I have available for giving at presentations to community groups and churches that might be interested in it. And in case you know of any, I've given one presentation like that already, and I'm looking to do some more as sort of an outreach project. So if you know of such groups, then I'd be interested in hearing from you. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for sticking around for the last session of the conference on a Friday afternoon. As an introduction to this topic, I first came across it when I was researching a historic district in Ogden, when I first forayed into the historic preservation field nearly 20 years ago as a senior history student at Weber State University and as an intern for the Ogden City Planning Department. So I was researching a residential district in Ogden to list on the National Register. I stumbled across a small blurb in a newspaper from 1890 about a company importing homes from St. Paul, Minnesota to be erected in Ogden. My interest was piqued as I wasn't aware of any such enterprises in the 1800s in Utah and was only aware of the larger, more well-known Sears and Aladdin and other prefab home companies in the first half of the 20th century. As I come to find out, my suspicions were correct. There are volumes written about the 20th century prefab home companies, but very little about those in the 19th century. There are a couple of academic articles excuse me, that have been written on these early endeavors. If you dig deep, you can find them, but there's not much regarding this longer view, if you will, of the prefab kit home mail order history. Although in my mind, this history is just as important. So to begin, I thought I'd give a brief overview of the history of prefabricated housing and explain what is meant by the term. And just imagine, if you will, being in the American West in the late 1800s and picking up a catalog and seeing an option to purchase a house. In many ways, it was a revolutionary idea brought about by an evolving American society and changes and developments on many fronts. This is largely a story about the opening of the frontier and the rise of industrialization. By the time the Ogden Patent Home Company was established in Ogden in 1890, also the same year surrounding states, Wyoming and Idaho, were admitted as states to the Union. We're looking at the far-reaching expansion of the railroad, a boom in Ogden's economy, a growth in Ogden's population, advancements nationwide in building and construction technology, which I'll discuss further later on. A lot of changes in real estate right around that time, and also in home ownership with places in general, as cities became more and more urban. As far as definitions go, when we talk about prefabricated housing, we are talking about a home that is either purchased from a catalog or a dealer, the dealer usually being a builder or contractor. The Prefabricated Home Manufacturers Institute and U.S. Department of Commerce define prefabricated houses as a home having walls, partitions, floors, ceilings, and or roof composed of pre-cut pieces, often coming in sections or panels, varying in size, which have been prefabricated in a factory prior to erection on a building foundation. Prefab homes were packaged by a company and bundled for delivery to the destination site, a process which was very industrialized. Prefabricated structures go back several centuries, and even Leonardo da Vinci played around with the idea. True experimentation with prefabricated housing, though, started to occur in the United States by the early to mid-1800s on a small scale, with cottages being fabricated and sent from London to the colonies in New England, and homes being sent from Asia and elsewhere to booming places like the gold rush in California that needed immediate housing. These early prefab homes were seen as temporary structures and were often made of other materials not seen in later models, such as with canvas and iron, and they are very modest in scale and design, basic shelters. Other types of early prefab were seen in the U.S. from about 1860 to 1890. Those homes were originated in growing industrial towns such as Chicago and Cincinnati, were often skeleton frame structures with board and batten skin that were pinned and bolted together. The homes were often sold to wealthier clients who had these built as summer cottages, or companies produced ancillary structures such as chicken coops, carriage houses, playhouses, etc. It wasn't until about 1890, the year when the Ogden Patent Home Company was established, that you start to see prefabricated homes produced for the sole purpose of permanent housing that were valued as a shelter. Now getting to this slide. Many additional factors led to this development, as I mentioned, starting with the expansion of the railroad in the U.S., including the Transcontinental Railroad being completed in Utah in 1869, with Ogden City soon becoming a main hub of that major system, which led to rapid industrialization and a booming Ogden economy within the span of just a couple of decades. Ogden's hot economy led to job growth in the city, which led to a population boom, and thus to major housing shortages. And secondly, and importantly, with the railroad, you now had a transportation system that could deliver goods, including houses, from one part of the nation to the other. In this case, kit homes being sent from St. Paul, Minnesota to Ogden, Utah. You can see the connection route on this slide. So, taking a closer look at the Ogden Patent Home Company and its origins and short-lived history, seeing a need for housing in Ogden and its prefab homes were well suited for rapidly growing areas and for startup businesses. Four enterprising entrepreneurs in Ogden, all with different backgrounds, came together and organized the company in June of 1890 with the goal of providing quick, cheap homes to a rapidly growing populace. James Brummett made his way to Ogden from Colorado in 1889 as a realtor to take advantage of the real estate market in the city at the time. Christian Garf was a native of Denmark and made his way to Ogden from Ogden in 1889 to open up a box and window sash factory. William H. Lever was an artist and a laborer who was also involved in real estate. A lot of people were, or attempted to be, involved in real estate in 1890 as the market was so hot. And he later became the foreman on the building site, constructing the homes. The fourth member of the company was Alfred H. Nelson. He was a successful Ogden attorney who also dabbled in real estate development and the insurance business, among other things. Nelson's office is where the company's office was in Ogden. It appears the genesis, or the idea for their business plan, was derived from a short-lived company that had established itself in Salt Lake City earlier in 1890. That company was created in April of that year to buy and sell building materials and real estate. And real estate, and to erect buildings throughout the city, utilizing the patents of Edsel Topman. I discovered the Salt Lake City business as I was researching this Ogden one. I'd love to do more research on this company as well. So the Salt Lake company used the patents of Edsel Topman. He was from Chicago, and he was a shareholder of the Salt Lake City company. He had some patents on home building construction, and the Salt Lake company used his methods to construct their residences. The big difference between the Salt Lake company and the Ogden company that was soon to form was that the Salt Lake City company manufactured and produced all of their building materials and kit homes on site at their lumber yard in west downtown Salt Lake City. This is just off 2nd West and North Temple. It might have been 3rd West, actually. As Ken mentioned earlier, the streets did change a block later on. So that was their lumber yard there in 1889, and so in 1890 they used that yard to make kit homes as well and build them throughout the city. The Ogden company ordered all their homes from a company out of St. Paul, which I'll mention here in a minute. The Salt Lake company only lasted a few months, about as long as the Ogden company did, at least their building of homes, and they just went back to being a standard lumber mill without the home building component. The key tie to the Ogden and Salt Lake companies was Edsel Topman and his patented home construction method. As I referenced, the Ogden company that the Ogden Patent Home Company, the company that the Ogden Patent Home Company turned to purchase their homes was out of St. Paul, Minnesota. They are known as Blodgett and Osgood. The owners of the company were brothers-in-law Harvey Blodgett and Benjamin Osgood. They originally started their business, like Christian Garf of the Ogden Patent Home Company's business, as a window sash and box manufacturing company, who later expanded to other building components and then entire kit homes. If it could be manufactured with wood, they could build it. With their kit homes, they utilized a type of lath sheeting put on the walls of the homes that was patented by Edsel Topman. In short, Topman created this sheathing with dovetailed planks, the lath, claiming this would strengthen the home's construction and enable the home to be able to shrink and contract without cracking the plastered walls. The image on your left, is an example of expansion and constricting with cracking plaster. On the right are some cross sections of the dovetailed lath that Topman invented to try to help prevent this problem, among other benefits. Companies producing construction materials and building homes at this time were marketing these types of patents as ways to help sell their products in their homes. And I don't know that Topman's patent here made much of a difference in the quality of the overall building of homes at the time, but it was a good selling point and marketing tool. Just like the later Sears and Aladdin homes and other big companies in the 20th century, marketing was really what drove these kit homes. Larger, broader technical advances in home building during the 19th century had far more reaching of an impact that made prefabricated homes and quick and easier home construction possible, compared to the smaller patents like Topman's. And one of the principal themes in the history of construction has been the desire to expand human physical capacities and economic resources by making less labor to do more work, in large part, which has led to technological advances that made the prefab of homes possible. As I briefly mentioned earlier, by the mid-1800s you had inventions in machinery such as the invention of steam and pedal-powered saws. You had new machines that could form heads on cut nails. Of course, nails have been very important in the history of construction and architectural history. The balloon frame type home construction was invented, and it utilized more standardized sawn parts and featured simplified joints which could easily be nailed together. And overall, this type of construction was much lighter with 2x4s and thus more portable. With these changes in construction, you also start to get a stronger division of labor and building components compared to the past, where you'd have an individual carpenter or builder who devoted a wide variety of skills to constructing a whole building on site. Now you had separate nail factories, window sash factories, mills cutting wood siding, foundries that created ornamentation, plants that created floor coverings, etc. And the prefabrication of homes by companies like Blodgett & Osgood, the Salt Lake Company, and the Ogden Patent Home Company, they brought this all back together again, as it was the most comprehensive application of mechanization to building. Houses like Ford's later became a popular slogan in the 20th century regarding the standardization and modernization of home construction in the prefab process, comparing it to Henry Ford's car assembly line. A little more about Blodgett & Osgood's company. The company had a large factory just off the main rail line in St. Paul, Minnesota, just off the Duluth main rail, which was one of the most important sectors of manufacturing within the Twin Cities area at the time. Blodgett & Osgood prominently advertised their homes as cheap homes and were marketed towards contractors as opposed to individual homeowners. And the homes were priced in the range of $600 for a small single-story cottage to $5,000 for a large multi-story Queen Anne. That's the wholesale price for the contractor. The Ogden homes being at the lower end of that spectrum, and they were eventually sold by the contractor in Ogden, by the Ogden Patent Home Company, once they purchased them from Blodgett & Osgood, for approximately $1,000, which is considerably less than a comparable sized home at the time, although very costly for a laborer still, who may have found his or her way to Ogden in 1890. Blodgett & Osgood also sold their homes throughout other areas of the West, with examples of them being found in Montana and Colorado, and likely anywhere else the railroad could go. In addition to the single-family homes like the ones in Ogden, they manufactured railroad stations, barns, and granaries. They sold their homes to the buyer, whoever that may be, usually builders, in lots of 5. Blodgett & Osgood continued to operate until about 1930, when their lumber yard in St. Paul went up in flames, and then the Great Depression set in. It actually stopped selling their kit homes before that, though. As the Ogden Patent Home Company ordered homes from Blodgett & Osgood, they ordered 5 during the first go-around, and an additional 15 the second time around. It's unclear how many more they ordered after that, but likely not many. They were only around in 1890. And making most out of freight charges, components for 5 small-sized homes could fit into a single train car, which seems like a lot for a train car back then, but if carefully stacked, and I guess the homes were small enough, they could do so, make it work. The company marketed these homes to locals as cheap homes in the newspaper. Once the customer ordered and purchased the home from a local dealer, the building lot would need to be retained and a foundation would need to be laid, which wasn't included with the kit home, in addition to a chimney and an outhouse. Smaller homes did not include a bathroom back then. After the home was delivered from St. Paul to Ogden, the kit homes were taken to Garf's Box Factory, which was close to the rail center and train station in west downtown Ogden, where they were briefly stored until they were delivered to the house site for the customer, which wasn't too far away. Likely by horse or mule, horse or mule drawn cart or wagon, took them to the home site where they were erected. Most of the homes appear to have been constructed less than a mile from Garf's Box Factory, so pretty close by. So this map and image shows a group of homes, which I believe are these kit homes. Once the homes reached Ogden, they took about 2 to 3 weeks to be completely built. And as a side note, the company touted that a builder of ordinary intelligence can set up and complete a house by following their simple instructions, which was a one-pager in the back of their catalog, which seems kind of wild to think about. Just a page of instructions to construct a home. But so it did take me a while to find one of these extant homes. I ended up confining myself into the Weber County Assessor's Office one day a while back until I did find something, had a breakthrough. Went through the old deed books and reviewed all the property transactions that occurred during the summer of 1890 until I found several transfers that took place in June of that year, which aligned with the dates I had for this company, and that had the names of those individuals involved with the company. So I looked at the map of these locations. I found that they are indeed near Garf's Box Factory, near west downtown Ogden, where the homes were stored originally, near 30th Street and Wall Avenue. So I identified the locations of these from the assessor's office. I drove to the sites and confirmed that these indeed could have been the homes. So I'm, about 100% sure this home is one of the homes, and that these group of homes are as well. But I need to dig a little deeper before I can make that confirmation. And there are other homes too. I think this is one of the homes as well, which was near Garf's Box Factory. The homes are generally built for blue-collar working-class families, usually to those working for the railroad or railroad-related industries, as one would expect in this part of the city during this era in Ogden's history. Stylistically, they're similar to other Victorian cottages you might see in Ogden and Utah during that period of time, but with some variation in detailing that you probably wouldn't see here and might see in like St. Paul, Minnesota. Especially at the detailing up in the gable there, there's some barge board. And if you look at the image from the catalog, you can see they're still very similar. This was built 130 years ago, but it has a drop novelty siding which came with the homes. The gables are similar, even the foundation's similar to what's in the image. The porch is very similar. And I think once they arrived here, there was a little bit of kind of improvisation that went on when the builders ended up constructing them, but very similar to what you'd see in their book. In closing, although this is a relatively small, short-lived company, as I've referenced, it does reflect and represent a lot about what was happening in the American West and in America at the time, particularly in terms of technology. Technology can be seen as a force of nature, but more importantly, as prominent architectural historian Del Upton noted, must be understood as a social issue, more importantly, not just a technical one, and that it provides a convenient solution to a socially defined problem, which is what we saw play out in Ogden with the Ogden Patent Home Company at the end of the 19th century. And I love that whole social history aspect of it. These early companies, and there are many of them throughout the nation. I just came across these 3 just doing some other research. They're throughout the nation, and they might not have been as long-lived as the later larger kit home companies, but they did provide much-needed housing to many. And as they enterprisingly brought together many technologies, they laid a solid foundation. So, thank you.
I'll offer a bit of response, and then we'll get to the questions. The built environment, the buildings, landscapes, roadways, and other man-made features is chock full of information that we often take for granted as we go about our busy lives. However, for the careful observer turned patient researcher, much can be gleaned from everyday landscapes that we inhabit. The homes, stores, offices, schools, religious buildings, agricultural and industrial workplaces that we personally inhabit or neglect in our communities may be investigated in order to answer historical inquiries. We may ask, why do our rural, suburban, and urban landscapes look the way they do? What human actions and values do they attest to in the past and present? Asking these questions may begin with observations in the larger world around us or in textual documents suggesting changes to how these landscapes used to look, which leads to physical investigation for remaining evidence. In other words, at some point, the built environment itself becomes a source and not merely a subject for addressing historical inquiry. Invariably, answering these questions leads to interdisciplinary skills incorporating textual, visual, material, and various other analytical sources that combine into compelling studies with far-ranging potential for more questions and further research. Here today we have 3 papers that do just that. All 3 papers involve encounters with features of the built environment that still exist, to some degree or another, throughout Utah. There is a clear change over time analysis in all 3 papers in spite of vastly different temporal scopes, suggesting that what was built in the past may inform, but often adapts to accommodate the shifting needs of the new present. In these papers, the authors implicitly adopt the assumption that cultural, religious, and family values of the developers and users of these buildings and landscapes can be distilled from the appearance, use, and shaping of the built environment itself. These diverse studies include a cooperative dairy farm in Box Elder County, constructed during the second half of the 19th century, the evolving religious landscape of Salt Lake City over the past century, and prefabricated mail-order homes in Ogden that flared up in 1890 and died down just as suddenly. I will briefly offer some individual remarks and questions for each paper. In the first paper, The Hansen Dairy and the Brigham City Co-op, Deanna Blake examines a landscape of commercial production that blurred the lines of private and public during a period of increasing tension between the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the federal government. In an attempt to maintain economic independence during the mid-19th century, in spite of the ever-increasing encroachment of outsider influence most neatly embodied by the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, the church and its leaders attempted to organize cooperative industries that kept local church member investment in local member-owned industries. One such industry, dairy production, proved particularly successful. While there is a clear understanding that the dairy cooperative was profitable, it does seem to be a little unclear as to whether or not the profits were evenly shared among the local Mormon population. Did the Hansen family keep a higher share of the profits while paying the local neighbors, contributing their cows in the summer to the operation, only receive payment in cheese and butter as suggested? Did the money from the cooperative go through the church headquarters or local church leaders before being redistributed back into the community, or did the Hansen Dairy only contribute a percentage of its profits to the church? Blake touches on the benefit polygamous families were to such industries where exceptionally large family sizes created large pools of cheap labor, and suggests that the non-Mormon population in Utah Territory suffered from such practices. A comparative study of a non-Mormon dairy operation of the same time period, and ideally location, nearby, and the specific Hansen family demographics might be a fruitful starting point to further explore these 2 intriguing observations about competing religious values and family sizes. What did other dairy farms of the same time period and region look like? Were they outcompeted in commercial operations and forced into subsistence, or did the competition force relocation altogether? Adding this lens of analysis could add greater technical parameters that might bolster this project's framework and flesh out greater meaning in its findings. The fact that the Hansen Dairy Farm adapted and stayed operational until the mid-1980s in different ways seems like a remarkable feat worth examining and exploring further. The current narrative follows a familiar arc of the federal government coming in and leaving the Latter-day Saint dairy operation in ruin. While in large part true in the short run, it seems like a clear explanation and deeper understanding of the changes made by the Hansen family on the farm following the co-op's demise might make for a more compelling, nuanced historical investigation. Surely it was a difficult and consequential transition, but the resilience of the people and their landscape seems to be more nuanced narrative waiting to be examined in this promising project. In the second paper, Ken Rockwell has given us a quick overview of a fascinating archive he has been constructing that attempts to capture the ever-evolving religious landscape of Salt Lake City, ranging from the early 20th century to the present. His centennial update to Newell Beeman's collection of photographs of historical Salt Lake City buildings isolates the religious structures of the past and includes contemporary photographs and Google Earth Street View images for visual comparison. The juxtaposition of past and present images offers an immediate wealth of information and research questions about religious and architectural change over time. There are examples of new ethnic immigrant communities arriving in the city at various points in time, adapting existing buildings, both sacred and secular, in previous use and design, as well as purpose-built religious structures that add visual and architectural diversity to the city's diversifying image. A thoroughfaring visual analysis and historical investigation into the significance of continuity versus change in architectural styles remains to be applied to these buildings. The collection promises to be visually stunning and supports the general conclusion that although religious values may have become increasingly more diverse in Salt Lake City throughout the 20th century, the adapted use and new construction of religious buildings for specific religious populations suggest an enduring high value placed on the perpetuation and transmission of religious values by inhabitants of Salt Lake City. Again, a comparative component: how does Salt Lake City's changing religious landscape compare to other Mountain West, American, or international cities, would help to offer a greater understanding of whether these changes trends are exceptional or representative of urban religious landscapes throughout the greater geographic scope during the 20th century. But this project lays the foundation for and enables future projects to answer such wide-ranging historical questions. Another avenue forward for this project's collected data might be numerical analysis of the buildings and congregants over time. Determine how many old religious structures are being adaptively reused and over which periods this occurs most frequently would be telling. How many of the abandoned buildings are being reused by alternative religious communities, and how many for secular purposes? How many secular structures in the city have been adapted for religious worship, by which denominations and when? And then, of course, what happens to the displaced congregation? With respect to Latter-day Saint meeting houses, the answer is often that the community rarely altogether disappears, but rather a single-story standard plan meeting house, either on the same site or somewhere else with greater parking spaces, often is built to replace the older structure that no longer meets the modern standards and programmatic uses intended for the congregation. Investigating similar questions about changing uses and relocations of congregations for other denominations and faiths could put this excellent archival tool to great use in mapping and understanding the movements and motivations of individual religious communities in the area. The third paper, by Chris Hansen, chronicles an investigation from a textual source to the physical survival of prefabricated mail-order homes in Ogden. An 1890 newspaper story mentioning the importation of prefab homes from St. Paul, Minnesota led to a rediscovery of a number of these completed homes in Ogden that are still standing. Hansen situates these working-class homes at the forefront of a third wave of American prefab kit home mail order history, where its commercial popularity would peak in the 20th century with the success of much larger companies such as Sears, Pacific Ready Cut, and Aladdin, as prefabricated housing became a viable business for erecting permanent housing. As a precursor to these successful national enterprises, Hansen suggests that the Ogden Patent Home Company's short-lived operations in 1890s make an important contribution to this history. The biggest question that could be more directly addressed is why was this venture so short-lived? Why did it and the Salt Lake City Prefab Company of virtually the same period only last for a few months? Did other national companies take their place with similar prefab housing, or did an alternative technological or building innovation displace prefab housing in this region by addressing the social problem in a more economical manner? One would assume that the need for more affordable housing for the booming working class population in Ogden during the 1890s didn't go away that suddenly. Was a national recession the cause? A related question that might be worth addressing more clearly: how does this short-lived operation connect to the future success of prefab housing? Or in other words, what factors led to the failure of this company in the short term and the success of the larger successors in the long term? And are there any direct connections or evidences that the later companies learned from these smaller enterprises? A comparative angle to help answer these and other questions might include a broader analysis of other homes constructed for working class in Ogden at the time. How did these compare to the prefab counterparts? Were there pros and cons that made either significantly preferable to the middle-class contractors or to the working-class homeowners? What can architectural layouts and exterior detailing reveal about class, taste, and region that was suggested in the statement beginning to tease out the similarities and differences observable in these St. Paul exports and the locally produced homes? The overall structure and narrative reveals a good amount of information that implies the significance of this relatively small-scale, short-lived prefab housing company in Ogden, but it would improve significantly by answering the above-mentioned questions more explicitly and articulating a clear argument for why the seemingly insignificant group of prefab homes in Ogden is in fact just as important to the history of American prefab housing as the 20th century successors that have been written about much more intensely. As mentioned earlier, these three papers have begun to investigate and question the historical narratives of the built environment and the people who designed, constructed, and used the buildings and landscapes called into question. There are numerous ways forward for each individual project to deepen our understanding of the past and offer greater, nuanced analysis of its complex changes and resilient continuities. But one area where I think all three papers could benefit is a more intentional and thorough attempt to use the existing, i.e. remaining built environment as an analytical source to address the historical questions being asked around them. In other words, what can be learned from direct observation and deliberate documentation of the remaining dairy buildings on the historic Hansen farm? What can on-site investigation and photographic comparison between the then and now architectural features reveal about the evolving values and practices of distinctive religious communities in Salt Lake City? And finally, what can measured drawings and thick descriptions of the remaining prefabricated homes of Ogden suggest about past and present housing needs and the solutions implemented for working class populations? If our panelists or anyone in the audience is wondering how would I go about implementing this direct observation methodology, one potential starting place is the book Invitation to Vernacular Architecture, a guide to the study of ordinary buildings and landscapes by Tom Carter and Elizabeth Cromley. It provides an overview to the theory and methods of built environment analysis, a useful manual to anyone trying to wrangle historical answers from buildings and landscapes. Through critical examination, measurement, drawing, and photography, much can be gleaned from the everyday landscape to inform historical investigation into the past behaviors, values, and choices of people of the past. This methodology holds the promise of adding voices from a broad spectrum of socioeconomic, religious, and ethnic backgrounds that can offer a fuller picture of the past and its meanings. And now I will continue to moderate, but turn the time chiefly to the audience to ask questions of our panelists. I'll have this over here. Any questions?
Yes, I have one for Kent. Do you have any photographs of the first two churches built, LDS churches?
LDS churches, namely, I guess we'd be talking about way back in the 50s and 60s, early ward houses and such as that.
Well, I actually attended the church in the second one built in the valley that was located on 3900 South between, excuse me, 5th and 7th East. Excuse me. Anyway, maybe I'll take a drink and ask.
Well, I can't speak too much on buildings outside of the city since I concentrated on the city, but I can tell you that the oldest existing church building that I know of is on the east side of the city, part of. It's sometimes hard to remember which is which, all those numbered wards, but over on 8th East, there is a ward house that has a part of it was the original adobe building of 1873. I believe that's the oldest continuously used building, even though it's now not the chapel itself, but used for other purposes, but it's part of the ward house. It still holds on. And it's funny, Newell Beeman photographed its successor, the chapel next door that is still in use, and pretty much neglected the original building, and I'm not sure why, but that's
on 8th East and what?
I think 8th East, or
South?
it's
Yeah, the 10th ward on 8th East and 4th South.
and it's
4th South.
why you get confused after time. I should have written that down or something. Yeah, exactly where, but it's I believe it's 8th East, somewhere north of 9th South. Anyway, yeah, that's the oldest standing structure, and the next one is the Episcopal Church. Cathedral of St. Mark's, which has been heavily remodeled, but you can still see elements of the original today. Those are the oldest that I know of.
Just following up on the church building photographs, were there any interior photos in his collection? Because we often get the exteriors, and they're pretty cool, but they never show people, and they're kind of sterile. And I just saw a photo that is the opposite of that. It was taken by the field gang of the meeting house in Tokerville, and it shows the people gathered out front and then sitting in the pews, and then after the meeting. It just brought a whole new life to the building. But so I'm just curious if there are any interiors.
Well, the new Obeeman collection is completely exterior, but we have others in our historical collection that do show some interiors, including the Cathedral of the Madeleine. And there are a few others, but you're right. A lot of the concentration is on the exterior architecture. My own collection, again, I focused on the exterior, but that was partly convenience because I didn't necessarily have access to the interior. But I did have a couple examples. There's the First Congregational Church on Foothill. One of the things when they moved from downtown, they took along their historical stained glass window, and I managed to get a photo from the interior, which is the better view to see it with the sun streaming in, as an example of how elements of some churches have been taken to their succeeding home. There's the altar at the Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church, which is on 7th South and about 10th East. That altar was in the original Catholic Church of the town, which is St. Mary Magdalene's, which was on 2nd East, and so it was transplanted there after the old church was vacated. And there's several examples of that, and I bring some attention to that in my collection.
About the prefabricated homes in Ogden. Can you tell me what the profit level would be for that company? They charge like $500 for a prefabricated home. How much money would they have made if they had ordered that for people?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty thin, which I think was, part of the problem with their business model. By the time they got here and sold them and erected them on the site, talking $100, $200 maybe total profit for each home, and they focused on the smaller, cheaper homes too. So it was quite the process to see a home through completion for that sum of a profit, which I imagine was part of what led to part of their probably why they didn't continue. I think they had a great thing going with making window sashes and boxes and stuff, and they could generate more profit producing those types of materials.
This is a question for Deanna. Did I understand that the experience with the dairy and the cooperative caused rifts within the Hansen family? And do those rifts continue today?
The money problems weren't necessarily so there were some money problems that were going on that kind of had some effect on the family later on. But the biggest problem was that Sarah and the second wife didn't get along. So they thought it was best if they just divided the family into two. And Sarah stayed at Sleepy Hollow and the others stayed at what they called Cotton Hollow. Cotton Hollow is still owned by the family, but Sleepy Hollow is now owned by the church. But the disagreements were basically they just didn't get along. There was a very big age gap between the girls, and the children didn't get along with each other very much either.
So the issues weren't really the dairy, the issues were the marital discord.
I think the biggest problem was that Sarah was the one who did all the work when it came to the dairy itself, because she's the one who had to make the cheese and stuff, and she did have dairy maids, but the other wives were not very good at it. That's how they explain it in the family's books and stuff. So she did a lot of the work, and I think she felt isolated from the other women. So there was problems within the dairy, but I think it was the biggest problem with the family was they just were not compatible, the other wives and the first wife.
And has that carried on?
Actually, there is kind of an isolation, not with Sarah specifically, but our family, we're still very close, and we can still talk to our like 5th and 7th and 8th cousins. I don't know. I think the one I know the most, my cousin Micaiah is my 11th cousin. And Micaiah is from the second wife, and my family is descended from the first wife. So it's very interesting because we still talk to each other, and we have a reunion out there every year. There's one set of cousins that we never see, and we're not sure why they don't like us. They just don't go to the reunions. And it's from the third wife. It was the third wife. So there is a little bit of a division there.
Yes.
For the prefab home, Chris, were those? I saw the picture, the one picture that had the homes close together that you thought was the homes. Did they have deep lots, and did they build onto them eventually for bathroom facilities? Did they have basements?
Yeah, so I've never been in one of the homes, which, I'm dying to get into the one especially that I'm pretty sure is one of the homes. I'd love to see if its floor plan is still similar to what was there. But it does appear that they have built on the back a little addition. I'm not sure if they have basements, probably not. Maybe little cellar spaces, if anything. And they weren't very deep lots. These were pretty, tight lots. They're less than a quarter acre at the time. They're even smaller now as the block's been subdivided as well behind them. So, yeah.
Oh, yes, please.
Follow up. What about plumbing and electricity? When was that put into houses, or were these houses built with none of that?
Very well, plumbing. So they had outhouses, so they didn't have indoor restrooms or anything like that. Electricity was pretty rudimentary back then. None of that was provided by the kit home companies. That would have been provided by the owner of the lot, who also had to do the outhouse and the chimney as well.
So no electric, no running water, nothing.
Very rudimentary, yeah.
Well, I have a question for you.
Okay.
So the group of homes that you think were all kit homes, that looks like it would be like a speculative development. Maybe the builder decided, I'll put these up, I'll sell them to people and make all the money off the real estate and the home and everything. But I don't know,
Right.
Have you been able to confirm that the developer bought all the land, carved it into lots?
So these lots were already subdivided prior to this operation, so they're already subdivided. I think they were speculative in nature, but it appears that they had already had commitments to the purchase of these homes before they ordered them from the company for the most part. So I think they just gave it a try, and in the end it didn't really work out. But I think it's all kind of very speculative in nature, and in 1890 in Ogden, there was so much real estate speculation and just wheeling and dealing. It was, it was quite a time.
One more question,
I might try again.
please.
In regard to, your presentation was basically Salt Lake City. The reason I mentioned this is I actually have photographs of the chapel, which was the second one built, which was on 39th South, and between 7th and 5th East. And that building, I'm surprised that they took it down. And I lived overseas for over 35 years, so I was just here in the summertime. But I think I retired in 2001, and I think maybe around 2005, they demolished it. But what was interesting about it, all the walls were this big stucco of yesteryear. And it didn't look like any church building that you could, that you would think of at that time, because it was at that time it was built like that. But interestingly enough, there was a stained glass that you could see from the outside of Christ. And on the inside of the chapel, you had another stained glass of Christ, very large. And I inquired what happened to those, and so I was able to locate. They were moved into a chapel on 50s off of between 33rd and 39th. And I saw them, they're way up high. You can actually see it from outside of the chapel when it's, the building when it's closed. So you can see they're huge. The two different ones, which was really rather interesting. And just as a side note, my father was had worked with painting the churches, and around the inside of the chapel, he had painted a sky with clouds and stuff, and so you saw Christ, and you could see the head of the sky around it, which was really interesting. I have photographs of those that were from in a pamphlet that they have printed that have them. So I don't have photographs, it's a copy. But that to me was really fascinating, and I was really amazed that they tore it down and then that wasn't all left, because I was born in 1937, so I went to junior or elementary school. Primary was in a log cabin across from, and so it was very different.
Yeah, you'd think by that time people were getting more concerned with historical preservation and that it would be preserved, but it's unfortunate. But they at least preserved part of it through the stained glass windows, as I mentioned other churches have been doing. It's nice to have a remnant preserved like that. Boy. But did you have any question for me? That just the observation here.
Well, I was wondering why it was torn down.
Yeah, we all like
because
that.
that's why I wondered where the first one was. Was that?
It does seem like there's, I have several examples of older ward houses that were then sold and they became other things. But it seems the current policy is to just demolish them. That's the cheapest thing. Or maybe sometimes it's more expensive to renovate than more expensive to renovate than to just tear it down. There's an example on the west side that where as I was doing my photographs in 2018, there was a former ward house that had been various things over the years and had actually become a private residence, but it was much larger than the family needed, so they actually rented out the extra space for special events, and on Halloween the basement became a haunted house. I photographed it in the summer of 2018, and then in October there was news that it was being torn down. It had been purchased by the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, and they were going to renovate it as a community center, but found that was just too expensive. So down it goes, and a new building is rising on that site. But I caught it just in time before they tore it down. So expenses, economics often gets in the way of preservation.
It's sustainable, adaptive reuse. Maybe haunted house is too feasible. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for all their preparation.